Welcome to the Classical Gabfest, a weekly discussion about the ever-changing world of classical music. I'm your host for this week, Tiffany Liu, and with me as always are Kensho Watanabe and William White. This week we'll be discussing the Metropolitan Opera's controversial new bargaining proposition to its unionized workforce. Then we'll take a look at the 2021 Classical Grammy nominations. And finally, we'll have a conversation with author Jonathan Rosenberg about the history of classical music in U.S. foreign policy. But first, we like to start with our prelude segment, so Will, what do we have today?
This week we'll be playing a round of everyone's favorite game, Name That Tune, aka Stump the Hosts.
And now Free Zone presents Name That Tune.
Music games don't come any simpler and any more intimidating than Name That Tune. And for us, this game is especially fraught because none of the three of us know what we're about to hear. That's because these Name That Tune submissions come from you, our loyal listeners. We make no guarantee that we'll be able to identify precisely what these pieces are, but we hope that hearing our thought processes will elucidate something about how we listen to music and provide some entertaining musical banter. So that none of us can see these submissions, we've once again asked our unofficial official intern, Joey Vaz, back on the show to help us out. Welcome, Joey.
Thanks. It's my pleasure to be here.
So, Joey, I understand that the first submission actually comes from you this time. You're trying to put us in our place here, to turn the tables.
That's right.
All right. Well, why don't you play us what you got?
All right. Here is my submission.
Okay, so we obviously all know what this is.
Within 5 seconds, it seemed like you know.
Should we say it at the same time? 3, 2, 1. Miraculous Mandarin. Yeah, by Bartók. Well, this was one that didn't quite stump us, but I think that it delighted us.
Yeah, I'm so happy to hear that piece again. I love this piece.
Not only were we happy to hear something fun, but also hear something that we actually recognize in the segment. So
yeah, wow. Okay, we're on fire. We're cooking with fire starting off. Joey, thanks so much for that submission.
Yeah.
No problem. The second submission comes from listener Tom. And here we go.
Do you guys recognize it?
no, I was just really thrown off by, did I hear a clarinet at the end of that
What
excerpt?
was that at the end?
So I was like, okay, it's a piano trio, right? Here, violin and cello and piano. And then at the very end of that, I felt like I heard a clarinet.
Yeah, or some non-string instrument.
Well, Tiffany, what did you think it was before we threw you off with our hallucinations?
So at the very, very beginning, I was thinking it's a Brahms piano trio, but it didn't seem quite, and it like something in me is saying Mendelssohn to me. Like the middle movement of the C minor piano trio, it could be that. And it would make sense because there was a phase in my life where I listened to that piece a lot, but I'm not completely sure. It does have this kind of like, you know, this kind of lush arpeggiation, right, in the piano and this like soaring line in the violin and cello that seems relatively, I mean, it's, you know, they're in unison. It's simple, but kind of elegant and soaring and lyrical in a way. I think it's Mendelssohn, although that's not a 100% call for me.
Well, yeah, my first instinct was also Brahms, but then, you know, Schumann and Mendelssohn are right there in that same milieu with him. So, Tiffany, if you think it's Mendelssohn, I'm going to go with you on that.
Yeah, I'm gonna guess the middle movement of the Mendelssohn C minor piano trio.
Well, I've played that piece and I don't recognize this moment, so I'm not exactly.
But Kensho, do you agree that we're in sort of the German romantic?
Yeah, and what was very interesting was the kind of like 2 against 3 rhythms that were happening. So there were these triplets in the piano, and then on top the violin and cello are playing duples, which makes me more think Schumann or Brahms rather than Mendelssohn in terms of that kind of rhythmic clash. But I'm still so caught up on this phantom wind instrument. Am I just, I don't know, maybe I just totally hallucinated that.
No, I heard something along those lines as well, but not,
So, but like Brahms has a piano quintet, which this is not that.
No, it has a clarinet quintet, but also that's not, doesn't involve piano. So
yeah, that's right. Oh yeah, like I can hardly think of any chamber pieces that have both piano and clarinet, right? It's like kind of string quartet or a string trio plus clarinet, or string quartet or string trio plus a piano. But I can hardly think of any, especially in this German romantic area, that has both of those things.
I'm just gonna guess Schumann, and not any more specific than that.
Look, I am stumped. I'm completely stumped. I'm going to say Brahms just to cover our bases as a team here.
Nice. Okay, so it's if it's Brahms, Schumann, or Mendelssohn, then we're right.
Well, this excerpt was cut to stump, but you did pick up with your sharp ears a clarinet at the end, because this is from Beethoven's triple concerto, which is for a piano trio and orchestra.
Well played, listener Tom.
Wow, we got totally owned.
Well played, Tom. Thank you.
All right, Joey, we got a third one here?
Yes, this third selection comes from listener Phil. Here we go.
Wow, I went on a real thrill ride during that. Yeah. I wrote down like 6 different names as it was playing through.
The genre or time period roller coaster right there.
Yeah, so my names that I wrote as we were listening were Rachmaninoff, Borodin, Gershwin, Schumann, Strauss.
That's so funny. I know exactly the moment where you thought it was Gershwin.
Me too.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I saw your face sort of light up too. Yeah. And I'm very actually happy where I ended up on that, which is with Richard Strauss. I think that this must be from the Strauss Horn Concerto, of which I believe there are 2, right? So this is probably the second.
Wait, so are you telling me you heard a horn concerto vibe in this? I felt like there were horn duets happening.
Well, what do you think of my Strauss assertion?
Not convinced.
Oh, interesting. Did you have a different composer in mind?
What throws me off is that kind of like repeated rhythm that was kind of all the way through, the dum, ba-da-dum, ba-da-dum, which I don't really necessarily associate with like Strauss, but maybe I'm wrong.
Tiffany, where are you on this?
I'm not really sure. When I first heard, I was like, oh, this sounds like kind of Brahmsy. And then what was it, like an add 6 chord or something that was a little bit like, bluesy, like that was like, put it potentially into like an American romantic kind of.
Yeah, there was like a slight Hollywood thing that happened about, 10 or 15 seconds in there.
Right. Yeah. So for a while I was sort of thinking, oh gosh, we're like back in kind of, well, not movie music, but music adjacent land. But then by the end, it started to feel more like conventional or like standard, like almost maybe Russian symphonic nationalists. I mean, I ended up with something.
You went on the opposite journey that I went on. That's funny.
Yeah, I went by the end. I mean, if given another 10 seconds, like I would have been trying to work my way out of Russian nationalist symphonic music. So I mean, I ended up sort of, I don't know, like Rimsky or
Rimsky, I did not have time to write down during my journey, but he was
because you tried to write Rimsky-Korsakov.
Yeah, right, exactly. Well, you know who's sort of at the nexus of some of those things that you were just talking about, Tiffany, is Korngold.
But I don't think this was him.
I got a Korngold vibe, but I just don't know enough of his repertoire.
I'm sticking with Strauss. That's my answer.
Oh gosh, I don't know. Yeah. I'll ride that train.
Tiff, what are you gonna do?
I'm not sure. I guess I'll pile onto this train as well, but I'm not necessarily convinced.
Oh, I'm not
I don't
convinced
have
either.
I don't have an alternative.
Oh, great. So you guys just want to join my train so that then you can put the blame on me when it turns out to be wrong. All right, Joey, tell us what it is.
All right. This comes from the first movement of early 20th century Swedish composer Wilhelm Stenhammar's Serenade in F major.
Stenhammer. Interesting. Yeah.
Well, I was never going to get that one, so.
Nope. But I did know of that composer and that piece. And that feels, right in terms of the context.
It's a cool piece. I would be curious to listen to the rest of that work.
All right. We got triply stumped. Oh no, doubly stumped.
Doubly stumped, which hey, that's I think improving.
I think it's better than we did last time.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we should say a couple of things here. For one, thank you so much to young Joseph for being our proctor on this edition of Stump the Host. Joey, such a great pleasure to have you with us.
For me as well.
And we're hoping to do another Stump the Hosts before 2021 occurs. So listeners, if you've got some more things that you think you can stump us with, please do send those in. And we also have the opportunities for our listeners to come on the show and participate in one of our musical games with us. All you have to do is post about your love for the Classical Gabfest on social media or in an email to your classically inclined friends. And if you tag or CC us so that we know that you posted or sent this message, we will enter you in for a chance to come on the show and participate in a prelude segment with us in the future. And with that, we move on to our first topic. So, Tiffany, what do you have for us?
Last week, news dropped that the Metropolitan Opera in New York City has offered to start paying many of their furloughed employees up to 70% of their former salaries, or $1,500 a week, whichever is lower, in exchange for new union contracts that include long-term pay cuts. To be exact, in order for immediate relief now, the musicians, chorus, and other workers who have not received a paycheck since April would be taking a 30% cut in pay, half of which would be restored once the Met's box office returns to pre-pandemic levels, which, as Met director Peter Gelb noted, might not be for several years, as far out as 2025. As many of our listeners will remember, the Met Orchestra was one of the most prominent and earliest orchestras to completely furlough all of their members without pay and without health insurance back in April. As we've noted a couple of times on the podcast, those members are hurting. You might be thinking $1,500 a week, wow, people get by on that amount or less per month. But remember, money is only as good as what it buys in the place that you buy it. So let's get some quick first impressions. Kensho, is this a Faustian bargain, forsaking overall well-being for temporary gratification, or is this more like a long-term kind of cut off your finger to save the hand situation?
I don't know. Maybe it's because I am close to certain labor negotiations that have happened in my previous line of work when I was at the Philadelphia Orchestra. This seems like such a hard line position that the Met Opera is taking to save money in the long run with their union contracts in the future. And I wonder if this is, I'm a little, I can't see this as a positive for anybody in any way.
I mean, it feels 30% is unbelievable, right? Like we have in normal contract negotiations, like negotiations can break down over 2 or 3%, let alone 30% immediately and over and as a frozen for a number of years possibly. Will, what do you think?
Yeah, that's a really good context to bring to this. And I think that the other thing is that's so wild is that Peter Gelb says that when the Met's box office finally returns to pre-pandemic levels, that they will only restore half of what they're taking away. So even then, in 2025 or whenever it may be, they're asking their unionized workforces, and this is not just the orchestra musicians, this is the chorus musicians and the stagehands, that even then they would be at 85% of their current salaries. Of course, their current salaries are zero because they're not getting paid at all during the pandemic.
Kensho, you mentioned having been near negotiations. Like, what was your takeaway from like the process and how it went and how to characterize it generally?
Well, of course, I was never in the rooms of all these discussions happening, but from, I think my first week on the job as assistant conductor, the Philadelphia Orchestra went on a strike for about 36 hours or so, just before their opening night gala. I know recently, and I think many orchestras that are continuing to work during this pandemic time have revisited some of their clauses in terms of media releases and like online concert revenue share that obviously did not have to be a point of discussion before, but now they're revisiting, considering that all of the institution's revenue is coming from that. But on the whole, it really depends on not just who is in charge of negotiation, who is in charge, or who's at the head of the administration, or who's at the head of the members committee, but also the kind of built-up history, right, in between the musicians and the administration. Like, how does the history play into it as well? And I think that in this particular case at the Met, I don't think many people would describe the relationship between Peter Gelb and the orchestra as amicable in the last 5 to 10 years. And I think that they have butted heads a little bit before this. And I think that it's not to say that this is a unique scenario in which the union and the administration butt heads, because I think that does happen.
I will say that one thing that's sort of funny about the world of unionized orchestra musicians at the highest ranks is that, they're not always the most sympathetic union characters, because, like, it's a very rare example of a profession that at its most rarefied level, the people are making really above middle class salaries. Like the musicians in the Met, I think they're probably all making six figures. So, it's you don't see like doctors and lawyers having unions. And then, sometimes you read these articles about unionized musicians asking, going on strike because of their contract negotiations. And then you see the numbers that they're talking about, and people, think about unions of like, a trucker or somebody operating like a forklift in a factory or something like that. and this is very different. But I think that the thing that's really important to remember about the kind of negotiations that they go into is what they don't want to do is cede ground, because musicians do see the larger context of their work, and they know that if the Metropolitan Opera cedes 2%, then that means that their colleagues who are playing in, the Omaha, Nebraska Symphony are going to be asked to cede 5%. And what that 5% means to them is much more than what the 2% means to the most elite musicians in New York.
And to put that in context, to go back to the numbers that are being offered, you're talking about now a 30% cut and only the option of recouping only half of that amount afterwards. So that ripple effect will be felt all the way across. They're saying that this might not, we won't get back to pre-pandemic levels of audience until 2025. But I think the ripple effect of this kind of pay cut would, continue past that, well past that.
Oh, yeah. If you're negotiating a new contract every, let's say, 3 to 5 years, and each time you're trying to negotiate an incremental increase of 2% over 2 years, then like we're talking, potentially 20 years down the line, you might get back to what it is. And of course, inflation and all this. So like, you're right, both of you, to point out that like the part of this which makes it really feel like there's a gun to your head is this aspect where they are not even going to recoup right now, what they have right now is what I mean to say. So only half of that 30% will be remunerated when they reach pre-pandemic levels. Yeah.
I mean, I think the most disturbing thing for me about this is the dangling of okay, well, we can pay you, like you're struggling right now. Here's this carrot on the end of the stick being like, well, we can give you $1,500 a week that might cover, whatever it is that you might need to pay for right now. I mean, most of the musicians have left New York anyway. They can't afford to pay for their apartments. But, that's, it's just about good faith, right? Like, if you're going to negotiate in good faith and say, hey, like, these are the costs and this is just the bleak landscape of it all, and there are going to be certain things that we're going to have to do to reduce costs. I mean, 30% even in that context seems like a lot, but it's one thing to do that and come in good faith and say, look, this is what the situation is, let's start talking. It's another thing to say, well, you're struggling right now, why don't we give you some money in exchange for this like industry changing union contract.
Yeah, so the whole thing does have this vibe of like taking your musicians hostage, which is, after all, what unions were created to fight. Like, that is the purpose. This like, saying, well, we have your jobs and you have our labor. So unless you give us our labor, you can't have our, your jobs. That's what smacks of the whole thing. You're right. I think that's, because when I first read this, I was sort of like, well, at some level, everyone is having to make sacrifices for this time. Like there's some, but this is not something that has been, the shape of which has been dictated by negotiations or any sort of, dialogue between Gelb and the board with the musicians or the rest of the employees. It's an ultimatum, essentially. And if the musicians have found a way to stick it out this long, it may be the case that they can make a cost-benefit analysis right now and say, well, a vaccine is on the horizon. If you guys start scheduling concerts, and we can handle you're not giving us. Frankly, if you're going to take a 6-figure salary, and if you've been doing any amount of saving over the last few, then get out of New York, like do your own thing for a year. You're probably also going to be fine, and then come back when you come back. A tough situation, and obviously our hearts go out to all, not just the musicians actually, but the chorus and the other employees who are affected by the furloughs right now, and keeping you all in our thoughts. That just about does it for our first segment today, so let's pivot over to Kensho for a more lighthearted topic.
Last week, the Recording Academy announced the nominees for the 2021 Grammy Awards. The classical Grammys have been relegated to the pre-telecast part of the awards ceremony and largely become overshadowed by the winners and nominees of other musical genres. Before we talk about some of the classical categories and their nominees, let me first pose the question: do the Grammys matter in our world of classical music? Will, do you follow the classical Grammys every year?
Not nearly as closely as I did, preparing for this segment. I would say that I'm usually vaguely aware of who wins in certain categories, but no, does it really matter? Let me put it this way. I think that awards, especially the Grammys, are totally overrated. They mean nothing, but I reserve the right, the second that I am ever nominated for anything, to do a 180-degree hard turn on that opinion and to espouse the idea that awards matter more than everything.
Yeah, when Will gets nominated, Grammy nominated will be the first 2 words in Will White's bio.
Be etched into my tombstone.
Yeah. I'm of two minds about this. This is probably the one of the strongest arguments you could make that I actually live under a rock, because I really do not follow awards shows. I rarely ever even, like, if we hadn't had our news alerts on for classical music happenings for this podcast, it wouldn't even have registered as a blip on my radar that the Grammys were happening, let alone what the nominees were or how good any of them were.
All right. So, well, with that, should we dive into some of these categories?
Well, the first thing is, like, what categories are there? Because I have to say, I didn't know prior to this segment.
All right, so here are the categories for the classical Grammys. We're going to skip the production stuff, right? So here we go. There is a Grammy for Best Orchestral Performance, Best Opera Recording, Best Choral Performance, Best Chamber Music / Small Ensemble Performance, Best Classical Instrumental Solo, Best Classical Solo Vocal Album, Best Classical Compendium, and Best Contemporary Classical Composition.
Well, there's 8 categories, right? And I would say that my biggest takeaway from this whole exercise of looking and listening through all of the nominees is that if this is going to be meaningful at all for classical music to participate in the Grammys, there needs to be at least 3 times as many categories. Because there are so many of these nominees that are in categories with non-like things, and I'm like, how are you comparing these two?
But can we also look at how many categories there are for other genres of music? Because it doesn't feel incongruent to me.
I looked at some of the other, I mean, like, look, there's a best tropical Latin album. Mm-hmm. There's a best traditional blues and best contemporary blues. Mm-hmm. Then there's a whole category for the packaging. There's best box set or special limited edition package. So, like, if there's those categories, we can't have, like, what I felt was, like, there needed to be more categories. So, like, for Baroque performance versus symphonic music.
Yeah.
Right? There needed to be a category for world premiere opera versus standard repertoire opera. You know, right. I just felt like that there was so much stuff in here that didn't make sense that it was together.
Well, and then when you think about the voters, right, they have to now sort through this and vote for it. I mean, like, how do you discern, you know, it's completely subjective in terms of it's almost like I was picking the music that I enjoyed listening to rather than the kind of the finished product, like how well does it capture the sound, or how do, you know, those were things that I think the Recording Academy would be interested in terms of, like, so how do you even explore or compare those techniques in recording when the categories are so diverse? I mean, you can't compare one with another.
And I would say that hardly any other genre has that question, this fundamental question of, like, do you enjoy the music versus do you think the music is executed at a high level? Like, those are not distinct questions in so many other aspects. I'm really not trying to denigrate any other genres, by the way. Like, there are obviously many ways in which other genres can be extremely excellent, in which execution is distinct from the composition of the piece. But most people, correct me if I'm wrong, when you go to an orchestra concert, they're thinking, do I like this piece? And that is just not the issue at hand when you are going to an orchestra concert. You have to know the piece and then also have an ear for what is happening in the performance that makes the piece still live.
All right, let's do some of these categories here.
All right, well, the one that you wanted to talk about was the best solo vocal performance category.
Yeah, I did want to talk about best classical solo vocal album, because I thought that this is actually where there was the most interesting stuff. Now, okay, so we've got American Composers at Play. This is an album by Stephen Powell. Then there's an album by Nicolas Pan called Clairière, songs by Lily and Nadia Boulanger. Then there's Farinelli, the album by Cecilia Bartoli. Then there's an album called A Lad's Love by Brian Giebler. And then there's Smythe, The Prison, with Sarah Braley and Deshaun Burton. Now, okay, I have a lot to say about all of these, but right off the bat, Ethel Smythe, The Prison, this is like a huge oratorio, and there's 2 people listed as the solo vocalists. This is totally miscategorized. This should be in, like, the best choral or the best album or something. This is not like a solo vocal. All the other ones are, like, more or less like a recital set that you would do. And then this is one large choral orchestral oratorio that happens to have solos. This should not be here.
Yep, I agree.
Just in terms of the category, right? Like, it may, they may be deservedly so to be nominated for a Grammy. It's just a category.
Oh yeah, I'm hugely interested in Ethel Smythe. I mean, I think she's a hugely fascinating composer, and I like her music a lot. I've done some of it, but no, this is miscategorized. Of these, I would say the one I would, for the sheer hilarity of the accompanying music video, I have to give this to Cecilia Bartoli with her Farinelli album. Have you guys seen this video?
I have not.
Okay, I listeners, pause the podcast, look in the show notes, just check out at least 10 seconds of this, and I'm going to show it to Kensho and Tiffany.
God, she's awesome.
I mean, come on, how can you not be totally charmed by that? She's amazing. She is amazing.
I remember the first time I saw her sing, and I was like, that is not human. That's ridiculous.
So anyway, that's my thoughts about that category.
Yeah, I did really enjoy the song cycle of I think it's Lily Blanchet, the Clairier.
Yes, in Clairière. That's really good. I Nicolas Pon.
Yeah.
Not that he just sings with a little too much vibrato for that music for my taste, but he's obviously a great artist. What about one that I'm sure that we all have opinions on is the first category, best orchestral performance.
I don't know. So one thing that I did want to talk about, because I think maybe perhaps this is more prevalent in our world than other genres, but this idea of a live capture recording being different from a studio capture recording.
I felt that those should be different categories too, Kensho. Yeah, like a live recording versus a studio recording should be two different things.
Right. And also it's important to note that when you have a live capture orchestral recording, they do still have these patch sessions afterwards so that they can, scrub away some of those blemishes as well. So it's not a complete kind of purist live, like we just captured one concert, kind of recording. But it is an important distinction to make, right? So I always do kind of note which albums are live and which are not. So I'm referring to the first album on the list, which is the Aspects of America Pulitzer edition by the Oregon Symphony and Carlos Kalmar.
Yeah, I mean, in this category, we have that album that you just mentioned. Then we have an album called Concurrence by Daniel Bjarnason and the Iceland Symphony Orchestra. Then we have Copeland Symphony No. 3, Michael Tilson Thomas, with the San Francisco Symphony. Then the Ives Complete Symphonies with Dudamel and the Los Angeles Philharmonic. And then the Ludoslawski Symphonies, numbers 2 and 3, with Hannu Lintu and the Finnish Radio Symphony Orchestra. Now, how you get 5 from all of the orchestral albums that come out in a season, I have no idea. But to me, the one that I thought was the most interesting was actually the Copland's Third Symphony. I mean, the Aspects of America, it starts off with Walter Piston's Seventh Symphony. And I know that he has some apologists, and there's some people who think that these mid-century American symphonies are, not as dusty and boring as I think that they are. And but he's just an example of one of these American composers who writes very trenchant, neither tonal nor not atonal music with fervent counterpoint, and it doesn't move me in the least. I don't care about it. The Howard Hanson Symphony on that album was a little bit more interesting to me, and then but then with Concurrence with Daniel Bjarnason, I mean, then we're just talking about this post-Erkki-Sven tour, Baltic states, sound cloud, sound mass kind of thing. I'm not really interested in that either, for being honest. Ives, you get to the Fourth Symphony and you get to some interesting conceptual album thing, right? I mean, that's what Ives is great about. It's pushing the boundaries of what is music, how can you play with musical ideas and forms and formats, and where are people going to be spaced throughout the hall and stuff. Okay, so that's sort of interesting. But the first 3 symphonies, especially the first 2, are sort of good examples in their category. That to do all 4 of them, I don't really care. The Ludoslawski Symphonies, more interesting to me for sure, but again, I don't know, fine. I much prefer his Concerto for Orchestra. So the only album that I wanted to keep listening to was friend of the pod, Michael Tilson Thomas, conducting Copland's Third Symphony, where they knew each other. There's a connection there, so I'm interested in what does MTT have to say about this music. Then there's the fact that he is such an interesting interpreter, as we got into in our segment on him, and I think that he did really interesting things with color and sound quality and tempi. I didn't always agree with them, but to me, that was the winner in this category.
Oh, folks, we have found a new character on the pod.
Listeners, just so that you know, listeners, for those of you who are consuming this in an audio format, we've got Will with a hoodie. Who is this on your hoodie, Will? Give us...
Alfred Schnittke.
Of course it is. Schnittke on your hoodie, and like these over-ear headphones and sunglasses, which I understand that you've put on because the sun comes directly into your studio at about this time of day. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And like giving his hot takes on all of the orchestral performance Grammys. Like, Kensho, do you have this screenshot where he's like looking into his like pop filter? Like,
I mean, there's just so many things that I can take from that. That's why I started losing it so early when I just realized what has happened, that we've found a new character on the podcast.
Well, what did you guys think of this category?
Nothing. I mean, you've said it all.
No, say something. Come on.
No, we're moving on. Thank you.
I mean, I'll go into that level of hot takes on every category you want to, but I want to hear what you guys have to say.
No, I actually agree with you. The one that really kind of jumped out at me was the Copeland recording, but I also did enjoy the Ives. Actually, there are some beautiful, beautiful moments, and especially the first symphony that I was listening to that I really enjoyed. So, but yeah, the concurrence thing, it was just hard to listen to, honestly.
Should be in a different category. I mean, it's not bad for what it is, but I just don't like, it's so hard to compare, And if I'm forced to compare, then I'm going to pick the thing that I actually like.
Right. Well, I think you're getting back to like the fundamental question, which is like, are you picking just like the music that you happen to like to hear, or are you able to actually get into it enough to like assess the performance, which is ostensibly what the category is about. But like, if you're going to pick something, like the music that was in concurrence, like, I don't know. I don't even know enough about that music to want to say whether the performance was great or not great. And at some level, it doesn't matter to me how great the performance was if the music is not palatable.
All right. So that just about wraps up our Grammy nominee breakdown. And if listeners, if you feel like the Grammy snubbed an album that should be on here, but we couldn't cover because they weren't nominated, please let us know. We'd love to cover it. All right, so we are moving on to our third segment. Will, go for it.
Jonathan Rosenberg is a professor of history at Hunter College and the CUNY Graduate Center, and the author of several books about 20th century American history. In his most recent book, Dangerous Melodies, Rosenberg recounts the history of America's foreign policy through the lens of classical music and musicians. Spanning more than 60 years from World War I through the Cold War, the book focuses on America's engagement with the world by considering how singers, instrumentalists, conductors, composers, music critics, and concertgoers linked the world of classical music to overseas developments. As we're now contemplating a new administration in the White House and thinking about what role classical music may play in world affairs in coming years, we thought this would be an opportune moment to look back at what our history can reveal to us. And for that reason, we are very glad to be joined today by Professor Rosenberg himself. Jonathan, welcome to the podcast.
It's very nice to be here. Thank you all for inviting me.
So before we get into the book, I was just very curious to know a little bit about your background. I mean, as an author of all of these books about American history, you actually started off as a Juilliard-trained musician. What is your musical background, and what do you play, and what do you do?
That is true. I did go to Juilliard, graduated from Juilliard. I was a classical trumpet player, and I worked as a musician for a number of years after I got out of Juilliard. I played and I taught and I tried to, had my musician's existence. And then eventually I decided to move in another direction, and I pursued graduate training, first in international relations, and then I got a PhD in history.
So you got trained at Juilliard as a musician, and then you decided to segue into more of a history, musicology kind of background. You spent some time studying at Harvard, and now you've decided to write this book. So tell us about the story of how this book came into being. What motivated you to write it?
The earlier books I wrote, a couple of earlier books, were on civil rights history of the U.S. civil rights movement. And one of those books was a history of the U.S. civil rights movement in a kind of global context. I was looking at the relationship between world affairs and the U.S. civil rights movement. So I've always been interested as a historian. When I was trained as a historian, I've always been interested in the relationship between America and the wider world. Mm-hmm. And obviously I have an interest in 20th century US history. That's sort of my field. I'm very interested in America and the wider world. And when I finished these civil rights books, I was thinking about a way to pursue my interest, my love for classical music. And I wanted to see if I could sort of figure out a way to meld these interests, the love for classical music and my interest in 20th century American history, and this, as I said, relationship between America and the wider world. So as I was looking for my next book project, I was pretty certain that I wanted to do something on classical music. And what I did, I mean, the process was I began going to the New York Public Library, actually the Performing Arts Library at Lincoln Center in New York. And I was reading all sorts of clippings, newspaper clippings from the 20th century about orchestras, about esteemed musicians and so forth. And what I began to see as I did this, as I was trying to formulate some questions and learn something more about the subject, I began to see what I thought was quite a fascinating relationship between the world of classical music and the wider world. And the more I delved into this, I really began to see all of these extraordinary connections, which frankly I wasn't really initially aware of, between the world of music and between important global developments across the 20th century. And ultimately, as happens as you're doing research, you begin to formulate some questions and things come into focus. And this book ultimately resulted from that. Again, a melding of my deep interest in 20th century US history and my lifelong passion for classical music.
Amazing.
So let's get into the book itself. I've been reading it and really enjoying it. And the book starts off sort of midway through World War I, when the United States is about to enter the war. And the context is that there's a lot of German immigrants, recent German immigrants, living in the United States, many of whom are classical musicians. And their world kind of changes drastically when the U.S. enters the war. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Classical music in America in the sort of from the second half of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, the world of classical music, the people who were played in symphony orchestras, singers, conductors, and so forth, it was a very, let's call it a Teutonic world. It was a very German world. And at the turn of the 20th century and after that, symphony orchestras in the United States conducted their rehearsals in German, for example. But what began to happen, and what had been percolating anyway somewhat before this, was what ultimately would become a ferocious anti-German sentiment in the United States. Particularly once the United States entered the war, the anti-German sentiment was quite ferocious, and indeed it was whipped up by the US government in order to kind of get the American people committed to the fight, so to speak. Well, that anti-German sentiment, not surprisingly, washed over into the world of American classical music and would have really diabolical implications for musicians, for the pieces that were being played. And it just completely, for a time, transformed the world of classical music in the United States, such that German music, some German music, particularly Wagner, Richard Strauss, was proscribed. That is, it was banned. Wagner operas were banned. Richard Strauss, as a living German composer's music, was banned. German musicians or people of either who were German immigrants or of German heritage were in many cases dismissed from their positions in orchestras. The two most perhaps celebrated cases, two of the most distinguished conductors in the United States, indeed in the world at that time, were the conductor of the Boston Symphony, a man by the name of Karl Muck, and the conductor of the Cincinnati Symphony, a man by the name of Ernst Kunwald. Kunwald was of Austrian extraction, Muck was German. And ultimately, for reasons that I explain in the book, Karl Muck and Ernst Kunwald were both dismissed from their positions and wound up basically in a prison camp, which held thousands of German, what were known as enemy aliens. It was in a place called Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. So after Muck and Kunwald were arrested, they eventually were shipped to this prison camp and spent the rest of the war in that camp with thousands of others. When the war ended, Muck and Kunwald were deported. They never conducted in the United States again after that. They were arrested. I'll just add what got Muck in hot water initially was quite an absurd event in which he was conducting the Boston Symphony in late 1917. They were playing in Providence, Rhode Island. The orchestra was asked to play the Star Spangled Banner, and they didn't play it. They didn't have the music with them. They weren't prepared to play it, and they didn't play it. Now, Muck was unaware of this request. As a result of that incident, which was shortly described as Muck refusing to play the Star Spangled Banner, which was not what happened, things spiraled out of control. Muck was seen as somebody who was questionable loyalty, not that he really needed to be loyal to the United States since he wasn't an American citizen, but that event sparked enormous controversy and enormous hue and cry across the whole country, such that Muck was basically thrown into hot water after that. People boycotted his concerts. There were death threats made against him, and ultimately he wound up being arrested in Boston in early 1918 and then shipped off to Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. He never conducted in the United States again and was deported and spent the rest of his career conducting ultimately in Germany.
Wow. Let's fast forward just a few years. I know you just talked about two conductors, Muck and Kunwald, but let's talk about Toscanini and Furtwängler and their tensions. And from my understanding, Toscanini was very overtly anti-fascist. Furtwängler was a little bit more complicated situation in terms of what he prescribed to, what he believed. Can you clarify some of those points for us?
There's no question, obviously, Toscanini spoke out repeatedly against fascism, first in Italy, and he had, in fact, Toscanini was, literally physically attacked in Italy for his anti-fascist views and his failure to play various fascist hymns and things like this, fascist tunes. So Toscanini was always a fervent anti-fascist and had spoken out repeatedly, first about what was happening in Italy and ultimately what began to unfold in Germany. So in that sense, his position was well known. He was considered a great spokesman for freedom and democracy. And his behavior, I believe, in this period is it's completely and utterly noble and worthy of the highest and deepest praise. Furtwängler, not so much. Wilhelm Furtwängler was, it is, as you say, it's complicated. Furtwängler was not a Nazi. He never joined the Nazi party. By all accounts, he opposed the Hitler regime, and he remained in Germany, he claimed, in order to sort of continue to bring to the German people the great legacy of German music. He would continue to conduct Beethoven and the other great Germanic musical luminaries, and he believed that was kind of a powerful, strong, antidote to Nazism. The point is that when other musicians, and this begins to happen after Hitler comes to power, other musicians are basically they're no longer allowed to work, particularly Jewish musicians, but not exclusively. They decide to leave Germany. Furtwängler remains, and he remains again not because he is a supporter of the Nazis, because he did push back against them at various moments. But it was seen by some, the fact that he remained there and continued to conduct in Germany and was really, in a sense, used by the Nazi regime to burnish its image because he's conducting the Berlin Philharmonic. As a result, Furtwängler was seen by many as complicit. What happens is that in 1936, Toscanini decides that he's going to step down from the New York Philharmonic. He's getting older. It's a taxing schedule, and he wants to step away. And what Toscanini does is to recommend that Furtwängler be the person to replace him. Mm-hmm. And he does this, A, because he has great admiration for Furtwängler's ability as a musician, although they are very, very different in their approach to conducting. They represent, I guess it could be said, sort of polar opposites in how they approach music. But nevertheless, Toscanini certainly admires Furtwängler, and he thinks that, well, if we offer him this position, this would give him a chance to leave the country, right? And now he'll have this opportunity, and he can sort of get the heck out of that place where he shouldn't be anyway. And what happens is the New York Philharmonic offers Wilhelm Furtwängler, who is the conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic in Hitler's Germany, they offer him this position. And he accepts it. He's interested in it. There's an enormous hue and cry in New York City, and also ultimately throughout the kind of American cultural community, about the fact that they've offered this guy who is seen, at least by some, as basically essentially like a Nazi, certainly complicit with the Nazis. This is seen as just an outrageous thing to do, to offer to bring him to New York, this guy who has been, basically working in some sense for the Nazi regime for the previous 3 years, despite some of the difficulties he had. But there is a great, great uproar about this. And it's not just confined to New York. It's actually all over the country. And I looked in many, many newspapers across the country to document this. Ultimately, what happens is, Furtwängler kind of sees this response, and he thinks, well, that's not a place I really want to come. So he refuses to come, which the New York Philharmonic at that point feels very good about, because they really don't want him there at that point. But there was a tremendous, as I said, uproar in the musical community, among listeners, people canceling their subscriptions. And I document this in great detail.
A little bit of switching gears here. I spent 3 years working for the Philadelphia Orchestra, and we went on tour to China because, as you know, probably the Philadelphia Orchestra was the first U.S. orchestra to tour in China back in the 1970s. And there's a long-standing tradition there of using music as cultural diplomacy. Can you think of other examples of this? And also give maybe your assessment of how successful cultural diplomacy is.
The U.S. government during the Cold War decided, partly in response to the fact that the Soviet Union was sending arts organizations around the world and was doing it increasingly, the U.S. government decided to respond to this and invested a considerable sum of money in sending orchestras, ballet troupes, jazz musicians were sent as well. The US government did this in order to really demonstrate to the world that the United States could operate on the level of high culture, in the sphere of high culture. We could do more than make Hollywood blockbuster movies, hundreds of thousands of refrigerators, loaded automobiles for American suburbanites. We could do things other than that. And we were not just, a race, as it was said, a race of materialists. We could do more than make a buck. And this was the impulse behind it. And this became I would say, critically important policy for the United States in the realm of cultural diplomacy. The first symphony orchestra to go behind the Iron Curtain to play in the Soviet Union was the BSO, played in 1956. They went to the Soviet Union. The Philadelphia Orchestra went to the Soviet Union, I think it was 58. Then famously, the New York Philharmonic went under Bernstein in 1959. And the US government and the kind of, let's call it the musical community, have very different visions about these tours. For the US government, this really is, although it's couched in terms of, international cooperation, et cetera. But what it really is this is an effort to advance the national interest of the United States, to show the world that the United States can compete in the realm of high culture. And there's some, extraordinarily interesting documents, including one that was produced by the US government, handed out to the musicians of the New York Philharmonic. This document, I think it's 28 pages long or something like that, entitled, "So You're Going to Russia." And it gives people instructions as to what to do when you go to Russia. And the instructions aren't they're along the lines of, bring a glossy magazine about the United States to make Soviet housewives envious, learn facts and figures, not about the Soviet Union, mind you, but about like how many telephones are produced in the United States and televisions. So you can drop that into the conversation when you're interacting with the Russian people. Now, anyway, so the US government has this very self-interested rationale for sending symphony orchestras around the world. Whereas the musicians, they have a much more universalistic and a far nobler view of what they're up to. If you look at the aims, say, of Leonard Bernstein, which is, the aims of enhancing international cooperation, empathy among peoples, and so forth, I as much as I would like to believe and dream that classical music and concerts and so forth can do that, I think if you look at the history of the Cold War, during and after those tours, we really don't see a lot of progress. And I sort of document this in the book. Shortly after the Boston Symphony is in Moscow or in the Soviet Union on this incredibly successful tour, the Soviets invade Hungary and kill thousands of people. There are tremendous tensions in the Cold War in the late 1950s and on into the 1960s, which overlap with these Cold War tours. So in terms of reconfiguring international politics, no, I don't think the tours did that. Do I think that if someone heard a concert, they were moved by it and they could be transported, if briefly, to a better place by hearing that music? Absolutely. Do I think they were able to establish some very salutary relations between American and, say, Soviet musicians, or American and Polish musicians and so forth? Yes, that happened too. But the dreams and aspirations of people like Bernstein and others, I think, were not realized by these Cold War tours. I think that that's simply just asking too much of classical music to do that. Classical music can do many things. It's enormously enriching, and it can have all sorts of impact, I think, on communities as well. But the transformation of international relations, there, I think it really was not able to accomplish much. But what I think is striking about these tours is they reveal so much about the nature of the Cold War. That, I think, is particularly compelling. They shed light on, they illuminate the tone and character and tenor of the struggle between East and West. And at the same time, I think they, again, illuminate at least the beliefs that certain people have in music's capacity to affect change. Whether music did affect change, I'm less convinced, but it certainly tells us something about the way people thought about music and the kinds of questions they asked as a result of music and the things they grappled with as a result of being involved in these tours.
Well, speaking of tours, Jonathan, this has been a fascinating tour through your research and writing and observations. It's a fantastic book. We certainly recommend it to all of our listeners. And speaking of recommending things, we're wondering if you would stick around and recommend something for our classical mixtape.
Sure, I can do that.
In our classical mixtape, we each recommend some music that's caught our ear this week to share with our listeners. So, Jonathan, what do you have this week?
Well, I suggested the Tchaikovsky First Piano Concerto. I think that's, it's obviously a beautiful piece of music. And it also does play something of a part in the story I tell in Dangerous Melodies, in that it was one of the pieces performed by Van Cliburn when he won the Tchaikovsky competition in 1958 in Moscow. And that music, in a sense, which was always very popular, became part of the sensation that was Van Cliburn and the Cliburn mania that swept not only the Soviet Union, but also the United States when Cliburn returned to America after winning the competition. I think in that respect, listening to the piece, if one can get the performance by Van Cliburn, can evoke the excitement of that era when Van Cliburn, a classical musician, was given a ticker tape parade in New York City, which attracted 100,000 people.
Thank you, Jonathan. Will, what do you have?
Well, my suggestion comes from the category of snubs and flubs. This is an album that I think really should have been nominated in the Grammy's solo vocal performance. I would have put this instead of the Ethel Smythe, The Prison. This comes from an album called Unexpected Shadows. Songs composed by Jake Heggie, performed by mezzo-soprano Jamie Barton, cellist Matt Heimovitz, and the composer Jake Heggie is at the piano. The name of the track is The Work at Hands, and man, I just think that this is gorgeous stuff.
And sit very still.
I really like Jake Heggie's vocal writing. I was gonna conduct Dead Man Walking, and it's really, I really enjoy it. I think it's great. Thank you, Will. Tiffany.
Okay, so apropos of our conversation with Jonathan Rosenberg, I started thinking about my own background in public policy, especially as it relates to what we in the field know as cultural diplomacy, which is kind of the act of sending orchestras or artists overseas in order to engender good relations, right? And of course, that led me down the path of John Adams' Nixon in China. So I'm recommending this week the Chairman Dance's Foxtrot for Orchestra, which was actually one of my quite early orchestral experiences. And I remember kind of endlessly practicing. There's a couple like loopy rhythms in here that are pretty, that require a good attention to detail. So here's the Chairman Dance's Foxtrot for Orchestra, John Adams.
This is, I think, my favorite John Adams piece. I love not only the rhythmic vitality and verve in the orchestration that we associate with John Adams, but I also love his allusion to sort of 1940s string vibes, which could also maybe be interpreted as like Chinesey kind of string vibes, with like these
there's
bends.
an old-timiness about this sound, because the part that we just played from the recording always speaks to me exactly like what I think of when I hear like old phonograph music. Like that's the kind of crackling that's going on around the sound and the tinniness of the fast vibrato. Like it's a very period sound, like a period specific sound, and we always associate period music with like Baroque instruments. This is period of a different sort, and I really dig it.
Yeah, I think this is my first introduction to John Adams too, and it's a very good introduction to that composer for sure. Thank you, Tiffany. So in celebration of the Dover Quartet's Grammy nomination, I'm a little bit biased in that I was classmates with the entire quartet at some point in my time at Curtis. So I am bringing to you an old performance because I was looking through YouTube, and the new album doesn't seem to be available on YouTube yet. But this is a 2016 performance of Schumann's first string quartet, the last movement, the Presto movement. And the videography is actually kind of cool in this movement as well. So I hope you enjoy. right. So you'll find the links to all these and to our full classical mixtape playlist in the show notes.
And with that, it's time to wrap up this episode of the Classical Gabfest. I'm Tiffany Liu, and on behalf of Kensho Watanabe and Will White, I'd like to thank you so much for listening and to encourage you to subscribe and rate us on Apple Podcasts. We'd also love your help spreading the word about the show on social media, where you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can reach us at classicalgabfest@gmail.com, and we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, happy listening, and we'll be with you next week.